Others have done this, but I also want to give my shout out to Wade and thanks to Wade for all of his efforts in putting this together this week and so forth. So appreciate to him and also his willingness to trust in me to teach tonight. Appreciate that. Also want to give an extra word of thanks to Mr. Stephen Estes. I had called him today. We had some things going on with the family, and there was about a short period of time there I thought I might not make it tonight, and so I reached out to Stephen and said, "Hey, Stephen, I know it's short notice, but..." And he, of course, graciously was ready to go if something happened, then I couldn't be here. So thanks to him for that, but here we are. All right, our topic tonight, am I condemning my family? And this is, if you have studied with very many people at all, you have almost certainly encountered this. It is a very common concern. It's something that we come across frequently. And before I get to answering the question itself, I want to do a little bit of what Zach did on Monday night and just kind of talk about some general principles when we're studying with people and things of this nature come up. And these things are not specific to the question of am I condemning my family. These are general to questions that you face in studying with people about the Bible. So, one of the things that I ask, or that I try to take into consideration when people ask a question or begin to have an objection, is where are we at in the study? Are we just beginning to study and they're already beginning to throw up objections and try to find excuses? Is this somebody who we've studied for a while and we're on the verge of conversion and we really have some sincere, we'll talk about in just a minute, some really sincere objections? And you may say, well, isn't the answer always the same? And to answer that, I would say go back and look at Jesus. And look at how Jesus dealt with people who asked him questions. He didn't always have the same tone. He didn't always have the same approach. You look at Paul, you look at the lessons that he preached, the sermons that he preached, and, there were people that Jesus knew. Now, I don't have the advantage of Jesus. I can't look into somebody's heart and say, I know exactly what's in your heart. But we do know people by their fruits, and we know some things, we can tell some things, and I think sometimes you can tell, is somebody really... Somebody asked the question, can God make a rock that he cannot lift? That person's probably not really serious about trying to understand the Bible. That's not really a serious Bible question. It's somebody who's looking for and searching for an objection to excuse themselves from believing in God. They're trying to find some reason not to believe. I say all of that to say this. Sometimes if a question comes up at the beginning of a study, whether it is, am I going to condemn my family by believing in these things, whether it's the emotionalism issue, whether it is specific questions about Bible things, sometimes I will simply defer that question. And I'll say, hey, let's talk about some things first. Because sometimes if you defer some of these questions and you go through some of the things of talking about authority, I almost always try to start with authority in talking to people. Because if you can get people to the same page of how we establish what God wants, some of these questions will go away. Some of these questions will resolve themselves by going through some of those things. Now, if somebody you've been studying with these things and you've already dealt with a lot of these things of authority and they seem to be on the same page, but you can see that they're really just struggling to get over that last hurdle, then you may approach them differently in both tone and in how you approach that. Because you may be dealing with a sincere heart that has sincere objections and needs some knowledge guidance, or you may be dealing with somebody who is hard-hearted and rebellious, as Stephen talked to the people in Acts chapter 7, and he said, you're just a bunch of stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. And sometimes you're going to face people like that. And so as we study, one of the things I always want to try to emphasize, and you've probably heard me talk about this when I was a young preacher, first congregation or two I was at, one of the things I did is I scoured and I searched for the right home Bible study. Whether it was a correspondence course, whether it was a series of studies, sit down with somebody. Because as a young, inexperienced, naive young man, I believed if I could find the right thing, I could convert anybody. Well, that's really foolish because, Paul couldn't convert everybody, Jesus couldn't convert everybody, and not everybody's going to be converted. And what the parable of the sower teaches us is you're going to find people with all kinds of different hearts, all kinds of different responses, but your responsibility is just keep sowing that seed. Keep preaching, keep teaching, keep trying to reach people with the truth of the gospel, and then let them have to wrestle with the consequences of what that truth is. And so we've already talked a little bit about the second part of this, the attitude in which people are, which they have in asking these questions. And I think this particular question, when I have encountered it, sometimes is somebody that you can tell they're really not interested, they don't want to be converted, and they're just looking for an excuse not to believe. But we're going to approach this from the idea that somebody's genuine and they're sincere and they're concerned about the idea, if I become a Christian, what does that mean for my family? And I will go back to something Zach said on Monday. We never want to mock. We never want to make fun. We never want to make light of their question. We never want to make them feel small for their question. I have, over my years, when I was preaching, I was fortunate enough to encounter a number of different preachers. And even as a student of the Word, even as a Christian, there were men that I studied with that were just, and somebody talked about this the other night, I think it was Jimmy the other night. Talked about somebody that he could ask a question, he'd never make you feel small for asking the question. He'd never make you feel like you had asked a stupid question or never make you think that you were wrong for questioning something. And then I have had the displeasure of talking to some other men who were gospel preachers who were unfortunately very vain and arrogant in their responses and belittled the idea that somebody who had only been preaching a short time or was a young person would dare question what they believe about the Bible. And that's tough. And it can often, especially when you're dealing with people who are not Christians or haven't yet built their faith, you can perhaps wreck their attitude from the very beginning and destroy their willingness to question and be sincere in their thoughts. So all those things as we then move in. So the first thing, if somebody comes up with this question, and I have developed an attitude about this even more the older I have gotten, and that is to emphasize the fact, here's the thing, I am not the judge. You're asking me to tell you whether or not your family will be lost if you do the right thing. First thing is you're asking the wrong question. Because they're not going to stand before me in judgment. You're not going to stand before me in judgment. They're not going to stand before me in judgment. God is the one who will be the judge. Let's look at these verses. Acts 17 and verse 31. We're familiar with Acts chapter 17 where he's talking to some people who, these were people who were generally not, these were not people who'd grown up with any knowledge of the will of God. These are people who believed in idols. In fact, Paul's sermon to these people begins in talking about their unknown God. And he gets to the end of his remarks to them, and he gets to this, and he says, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness. By the man whom he has ordained, he has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. He says, God has assured that he will bring everybody into judgment, and here's how he's proven it. He's proven it by raising Jesus from the dead. Now, these people got caught up in the fact that Paul was talking about men being raised from the dead, and they weren't sure they could wrestle with that. And we don't know that Paul ever got another opportunity to talk to these people in Athens, at least not in this particular environment. But he makes it very clear, God is the one who will bring all men into judgment. There's a number of reasons why this is an important question. Any of you who've ever had any dealings in a court of law and where you were looking for a rendering of judgment from a judge, Your lawyer may have told you, we got a good judge for this because of the way they interpret the law or where they come down on things. Or they may tell you, well, we didn't get a very good judge. This judge is kind of hard on these things. But the bottom line is, the person that you're trying to convince and the person that you're trying to make your case to is the person who renders that judgment. So when it comes down to, am I going to be right or am I going to be wrong? Who are you needing to appeal to? And who are you needing to make sure that you please? It's not me. When you talk about whether I am condemned or my family is condemned, have you asked, what does God the judge say? God the judge is the one that you need to ask. And if you respect that, then you're going to go to His will and you're going to say, what does His will have to say about that? Because I'm not the one who makes that judgment. I could sit here and tell you, you know what, your family's going to be just fine. And you get to the day of judgment and God says, no, they're not. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later if we have time. And the bottom line is, I'm not the one being the judge. Again, Paul says in Romans chapter 14, and let me, for those of you who've been in my classes, you know that I have a tendency to just talk and go on. So if you have a question or a comment, don't hesitate to raise your hand, even if I haven't stopped and said, hey, do you have a comment? But feel free to raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. Romans 14, beginning in verse 10, he says, why do you judge your brother? Or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me and every tongue shall confess to God. I find this particularly interesting, a particularly interesting reference in the context of our question. Who are you to judge your brother? And we know that he's talking here about some things that are matters of judgment. We also know that we do have a responsibility to render certain judgments, both to those within the church and to those to whom we're preaching. Jesus said, don't cast your pearls before swine. He also told the apostles there comes a time when you got to dust your feet off and move on. So we're not saying that there is no sense in which we ever render a judgment. But what Paul says here is what you need to be more concerned about than going around and being involved in judgment is recognizing that God is the judge and that you're being right before Him and that your life is what it needs to be before Him. He's the one to whom we will give answer. And then again, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, and this again is another interesting context because he's talking about the temporary nature of this life and the fact of the life that we're looking forward to and making sure that we're absolutely ready for that. Instead of being concerned about what happens in this life, he says, verse 9, therefore we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to Him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. So the very first thing that I would emphasize to anybody that raises this question is, I'm not the judge. You want to ask that question, ask the judge about that question. Because I can't give you consolation. It's similar to the idea of, do you really believe that somebody he's believed the Bible and he's repented and he's on the way to the church building and he dies in a car wreck on the way to the church building, you really believe God's going to condemn that person because they didn't get baptized in water? I'm not the judge. Thank goodness. That's not my responsibility to figure that out. I can tell you, I hope I don't ever get caught in that. I wouldn't want to be caught in that situation based on what the Bible teaches. And do you want to ask me, what does the Bible say? I'll be glad to tell you. But I am not your judge. I'm not your family's judge. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what your family is or isn't. That's not my responsibility. All right. I will take a breath here and ask, are there any questions or comments at this point? Stephen.
So I guess you can flip that around with the individual you're studying with or questioning you. Say, well, if I am not capable
Exactly. Excellent point. All right. For those who didn't hear, what Stephen said was, you can flip that back on them. If I'm not capable of being the judge, neither are you. You can't judge whether they're saved or lost either. And so it takes the responsibility off you of making that, the person in the situation for making that judgment. Any other comments, thoughts, questions? JD?
In regards to that, flipping it around, since we're not the judge, neither is the person in question, you could also say that in that same vein, or in that same context, that at the end of the day, this choice to follow God, as cold as this may sound at first, isn't about that individual's family. This is their choice about their life, their spirit, their soul, their spiritual life. Like I said, as cold as that may sound, perhaps it'd be best to focus on if this is what that individual actually wants before concerning others.
So you bring me to my next point. Thank you. And that is Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27. Whatever our fate is, it's sealed at death. Look at Hebrews 9 verse 27. And it is appointed for men to die once, but after this, the judgment. Here's the thing, we get one shot at this. We get one shot to make it right. And once we die, that fate is determined. If I die in a lost condition, it doesn't matter what my children do or don't do, it's not going to change my fate. So asking the question, does what I do condemn my family, it doesn't change their fate. Their fate is sealed. It's done. It's not going to change. The truth is what the truth is. They are already, if they have left this life, they are already determined whether they're lost or saved. Now, you may determine you don't want to join them. Maybe they're lost, maybe they're saved. But you may make a decision based on what you think their outcome is, but their fate is already sealed. And what you do doesn't change that. If, in fact, what they did not match the truth, and they are not saved, and are not in heaven, you deciding not to do what is right is not going to help them. It's not going to change their outcome. And I know there are various religions, Catholic, Mormon, others, that believe that you can change the fate of those who have already died. The Bible teaches exactly the opposite. Hugh?
The story of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man had died, and he didn't want his family coming to where he was.
Are y'all looking at my slides? Did somebody pass up my slides in advance?
I did put them up, but
See, he cheated. He saw my slides ahead of time. Go ahead.
I'm done. I jumped into Braden's mouth.
Oh, you're fine. I'm just giving you a hard time. No, I think you're absolutely right. And it does lead us actually to the next point that we have on the slide, actually. Because as I was thinking about this, that was the very next thing that comes to mind. Let's turn over to Luke chapter 16. And I thank both JD and Hugh for introducing into each of my next slides and saving me the trouble. So we're familiar with the story of rich man and Lazarus. I'm not going to read the entire thing. I want to focus beginning in verse 24, really. We know the rich man and Lazarus both died. The rich man in verse 24 cried and said, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame." But Abraham said, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things, but now he is comforted and you are tormented. And besides all this, between us there is a great gulf fixed, so that those who want to pass from here to you cannot, nor can those from there pass to us." So that reemphasizes what we just talked about in Hebrews 9, right? Here we have a practical example of what we just talked about in Hebrews chapter 9. And Hugh made a great connection to this. Because I can't imagine, here it is. It's done. The rich man, his life is over. He cannot change his fate. He can't even get a moment of relief. It's done. But recognizing that, what then does he turn to next? He turns to, what about those that are still on earth? What do I want for them? What is my desired outcome for them? So verse 27, he said, I beg you therefore, Father, that you would send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. Abraham said to him, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, no, Father Abraham, but if one goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to them, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. There is so much in this story that we can gain and that we can learn from. But this is, I think, one of the big points here, is that if people die and go into torment, their attitude is not, man, I hope the rest of my family does exactly what I did and they join me here because I don't want to be all by myself here. His attitude was, I don't want anybody else to come here. I don't want any of my family to come here. He evidently knew that his brothers maybe had some of the same attitudes and some of the same problems that he did. And he wanted somebody to be able to convince them that this is not where you want to be. And so again, as you talk to a person who's wrestling with, well, if I do this, what does that mean for my family? Does that mean that I am condemning them? And as we've already pointed out, you're not doing anything for them. But even if the outcome, let's assume the worst case outcome, it means that they are lost. Do you think that if that's the case, they'd want you to join them? You think if that's where they are, their attitude would be, man, I hope they do the same thing I do. I hope they end up in here with me. The story of the rich man and Lazarus says otherwise. Now, obviously, while it's not our main text for tonight, our main purpose for tonight, the other such valuable lesson here, and one of the questions that you face many times is, why can't I see miracles today? Why can't you give me some sign today? Or people who believe they have signs today. And Abraham said to the rich man, he said, they won't even believe if somebody goes back from the dead. If their heart is not willing to listen to Moses and the prophets. And as we talk to people such as this, we have to convince them that the only evidence we have of truth is what the Word of God tells us. That's it. That's all I have. All right. Any additional questions, comments, thoughts? Anybody else know what's coming on the next slide? My last 2 slides have been preempted and pre-revealed. So anybody else? Go ahead, JD.
Sorry for spoiling.
Oh no, I'm glad. Hey, you know what? Here's the thing. Let me clarify on that. I know I joke about it, but you know what? It reveals to me that we're all thinking on the right direction. We're thinking the right way. And it reveals what I believe, and that these are not necessarily hard or difficult concepts. They're things that we're familiar with. And maybe sometimes we just need to bring them to the surface and maybe make the connection between the different things. So go ahead.
In regards to the rich man, he lived a life of leisure and didn't care about anyone but himself. And the second his eternal torment, or I guess any torment started, he was thinking of others not wanting anyone to join him, because once he was in that eternal torment, he knew how bad it was. So it makes a prime example as to what, if anything, I may have lost my original train of thought here, but it also makes a good point to my previous statement of this being the individual's choice. This rich man wound up in, using the Greek term here, Tartarus, because of his selfishness. His selfishness in life cost him that paradise. Conversely, we have the choice in this, like you said, one shot to make the right decisions. And also, like you said, what we do doesn't impact others. We can be a good example to them. We can hope to show them the right path. Whether or not they walk that path is their choice alone. Just like whether or not we walk this path as individuals is our choice alone. Not theirs, not our ancestors 100 years ago, ours.
Right. You know, another thing in this, and when you're talking, okay, Sean and Ryan, give me 1 second, I'll come over here. One other interesting thing in looking at this is sometimes people look for, there's so many different ideas about what hell is or what eternity is about. Many people want to minimize the impact of hell. You go into a state of unconsciousness, or you go into a place and you're sort of there for a little bit and then you burn up and you're done. Jesus uses this example, and he demonstrates to the audience that he's seeking that this rich man had a consciousness of where he was. He had a consciousness of the significance of the pain of where he was, and it was so bad he wanted even just a moment's relief. He wasn't saying, hey, I can hang out here for a few years till it's over. He wasn't, none of that. And so as you're talking to this person and you're saying, I don't know, am I going to condemn my family? You have to ask, as JD pointed out, bring this back to the individual. Is this, if you believe this is what Jesus said, the outcome is for those who are outside of a relationship with Him, are you willing to risk that for whoever it is that you're concerned about? All right, Sean and then Ryan.
I think about if the rich man converted in life and had to think about the fact that his brothers went there when he was saved at that point. There's oftentimes almost a reversal where people are almost grief-stricken because they think about something that could have been different, something that they could have done, something that could have impacted the choice of someone that they love. Let's not forget the severity of that reality. My father is still tormented by the fact that my grandfather was not a faithful person at all. Grieved him for a very long time. But he always told me that Philippians 3:13 through 16, the mature Christian will always think ahead and do not look back, because that is what the mature thing is to do. It is hard, but that is what we have to do, because if we get pulled into that, whether anything that we've done in the past, with family and friends, in the present now, or even in the future, we have to come to terms with that is their choice, and that we have to accept that. Do not dwell on that for too long, otherwise it will do nothing but hurt you.
Okay, good point. Ryan?
Yeah, just real quick, I was kind of guilty of a variation of this thought process when I was deciding to become a Christian, in that not so much condemning those who have passed away, but condemning my entire family that's currently living. Because in accepting accepting this, I am in a sense acknowledging that they are not right, and plug our theme, that turns your world completely upside down, and it's sometimes it's very, very difficult, mountain to climb logically. And just to reiterate what JD was saying about the individual component of this, that you have to work out your own salvation. So Philippians 2:12, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Like, that's what it comes down to. You might have a faithful family or a not faithful family, but at the end of the day, it's your responsibility. So that helped with my process.
Yeah, now you didn't get my next slide, but you made me think of one I wish I had put in, because he makes an excellent point. Maybe you're not talking about those who have passed away, but what about all those who are living? What about somebody who comes out of a strong Catholic background or a strong Baptist background and they've got a lot of family still alive? Thinking on that, can you think of any scenario in the New Testament that would be parallel to that?
The entire Jewish nation.
The entire Jewish nation. Isn't that what every Jew who accepted the will of God, whose family were still believing that Jesus was not the Messiah, isn't that exactly what they were doing? Isn't that why Jesus said, I'll turn brother against brother, father against son, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law? Because not everybody among the Jews was going to accept that he was the Messiah. Here you have people that have been taught from God's own word for how many centuries about what the Messiah is and who they expect him to be. And now they're suddenly being told, that's not right. You're being forced to say, all that we grow up knowing, Gamaliel, the teacher, and all of these men who were respected as religiously knowledgeable of the law, you're standing up and saying, they're all wrong. And they're all lost. And all of my family that remains true to serving that. Isn't that what the entire book of Hebrews is about? People who were struggling because they were facing persecution. They wanted to go back to what they had before. You could use the book of Hebrews for this kind of a deal. So excellent point, Ryan. Appreciate it. And to Sean's point, we do have to be careful that we don't dwell on things. And it does tie in somewhat to the next point that I was going to make. And that is, one of the things we have to think about in this is that while we can't dwell on the mistakes that we've made, and I am the first to stand here and tell you, with 5 children who are not serving the Lord, it's something that I think about regularly. What could I have done different? What should I have done different? How should I have taught them better? How should I have changed things? But as you're sitting here talking to this person who's focusing perhaps on those who are gone, maybe turn this into a positive and say, what about the impact on others coming after you? What about the impact on those that are still alive that you can have? JD, I know you had a comment toward the end of the last slide, but I wanted to tie that in before I came back. So what was your comment?
I think I lost it. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry it took so long to get back to you.
I was just thinking about, I think people are going to believe what they want to believe. It doesn't matter who says it or what they say. And I think the Bible teaches that. In fact, when Moses parted the Red Sea, that would scare me to death. I would have never forgotten that rest of my life. And most of those people have seen that. Most of them died out of God. Very few of them. It always goes back to original. That's what it goes back to.
There's no doubt that there are a large percentage. I mean, what did Jesus say about the wide path and the narrow path? You know, there's going to be a whole lot more people that are willing to do what's easy than to do what's right. That's just the way it is. And there are a lot of people who are going back to what we started with, who's just going to have a mentality of, I don't want to do this. Let me find the excuse that works to avoid doing what I want to do. But there are, and we've all studied with some, and many of us have had the opportunity to convert some of those who do have genuine hearts, who do want to do what's right. Look at Cornelius. Cornelius is an example of that. Cornelius is an example of a man who was out there in the world. He wanted to know what was right. And when confronted by Peter with, hey, you wanted to know what truth is, here it is. He and his household said, hey, that's what we're going to do.
I got what I was wanting to say earlier in regards to what you asked, what examples there were. The one that I was thinking of was, I can't remember the exact verse, but when he told the one man who wanted to say goodbye to his family, or the other one who wanted to bury his father in the respective tomb, that one.
Yeah, now that parable has really more to do, or that tale really has to do about our own priorities of service, doesn't it? But you're right, there is a there is a certain analogy there to I'm trying to hold on to something instead of being willing to let go.
The concept of whether or not I obey Christ doesn't really end up affecting reality on where those people actually are or the state of their soul currently. And so by us choosing to be blind to it and not obey Christ and denying reality isn't helpful to them.
Right.
It doesn't change the outcome. So it's just really a form of, are we going to obey Christ and help them by obeying Christ, or are we going to do the easy thing and choose to be blind because it doesn't change reality either.
Right. Comes back to what you do doesn't affect their fate. And you can either choose to obey Christ, you can choose not to obey Christ. That's really the bottom line decision here. From a positive standpoint, on the idea of impacting future generations, Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4. We're familiar with the passage. God placing the responsibility squarely on the fathers. You fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. You know, I know pretty much anybody who's ever taught and for very long has made this assessment and talked about this, but a lot of people, their children grow up and they go, well, man, I don't know what happened. I brought them up in the church. I brought them to church every Sunday and I don't know what went wrong. Sometimes we blame the church. Sometimes we blame the elders. Sometimes we blame the lack of elders. But it's interesting, throughout the Bible, there's one place where the responsibility for the teaching of training of children is always placed, without exception. I'm not saying it's wrong to have Bible classes. As long as we understand it's not the responsibility of the church to train our children. If tomorrow we decided we're not going to have Bible classes anymore, that would also be according to the Scriptures, because the Scriptures don't command that we have to have Bible classes for the children. Do I think it's a good idea? Sure. They're here. It's an opportunity to teach them, to instill some of the Word of God in them. But the bottom line is the real responsibility for that is on the shoulders of the parents. And in this very discussion that we're having, I remember vividly my father on more than one occasion talking about the fact of how glad he was that somebody had come to his father and his mother who were not Christians growing up and taught them the truth so that they could teach him the truth. And by them learning the truth and passing it on to him, not only did they have an impact in their own lives for the truth and whoever else they may have taught. My grandfather was an elder in the church that he was a member of for a number of years. But he raised my father, who became a gospel preacher, who not only converted people over the years, but taught and trained so many other people. So as I sit here and as I go, okay, well, should I be thinking about, am I condemning people who are already, as we've pointed out, their fate's already sealed? The reality is, what's done for them is done. Or am I thinking about, if I can have the truth, and I know what the truth is, how many people then can I pass that on to? Both of those that are still alive, and maybe those that are yet to come, children, grandchildren. And what impact not only I may have directly, but indirectly. If I take the truth, one of the greatest ways the Word of God can be spread is into our families and through our families. And so we look not backwards at, well, if I do this, look at all the people who are lost. I look at, if I understand this is the truth, how many people can I advance moving forward and teach the truth moving forward? I think I saw a hand over there. Sean?
I came to grips with a concept very quickly. And it's a saying that I have started repeating a lot more in my head as I've gotten older. But it is not just for your children, but also the people you interact with on a daily basis. In order to help others, let's take, for example, studying the Bible, actually studying the Bible. In order to help teach and instruct, I can't just tell them that they need to do this. I have to do this. I have to do it as well. in order to guarantee to help people get somewhere, to give your children a better chance, you yourself must be better for the sake of your children, for the sake of your friends, for the sake of your family. And not doing so is hypocrisy, which is the fastest way to ever turn someone against Christ.
Right. Good point. We got to be genuine and true in what we're doing. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 5, another very positive example. When I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also. And this is an example of what I was just talking about. Here are two women who had an impact on this young man, Timothy. And you say, well, it's just one man. But think about something. Think about just how highly Paul thought of Timothy. He had just parted ways with somebody else because he didn't feel like he was constant enough and true enough in what they were doing. And he left him behind, and he comes to this young man who is possibly as young as a teenager, probably no older than young 20s, early 20s, when Paul says, I want him to travel with me. How did that come about? Through his mother and grandmother. Because they had chosen, and they came out of a Jewish background. They had stepped away from what they had believed all their... How many people, when they obeyed the gospel, did they leave behind in the Jewish faith? And yet they, through their faith, instilled that in Timothy, who then became a preacher who traveled with Paul, and who Paul had the confidence to leave and carry on the work of an evangelist. And how many other lives did that impact? Now, the contrast to that is 1 Peter 1, verses 17 and 18. And I say contrast because it shows what could happen. He says, I have a hunch that's supposed to be 2 Peter. Hold on. That doesn't look like the right verse there.
Verse 18 says, inherited the ways from your forefathers.
There you go. That was it. I just skipped over it somehow. I missed it when I was reading it. Thank you, Hugh. And if you call on the Father who without partiality judges each according to one's work, there's a concept we talked about earlier. Conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers. There were people who had received something, it had been passed down, and there were some people who just kept passing it down. What was it? Aimless conduct. So that's one option. We can hold on to something just because it's what's been passed down, just because what everybody in our family's done, or we can be redeemed from that to do that which is right, and then pass that on to other generations. Which will we choose? All right, we're almost out of time. I want to touch on one last concept, and this, I think, is really important to understand, and we touched on it just a little bit earlier. We're all familiar with Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23. Wherein Jesus warns of those who seem to think that they are servants of His, or claim that they are servants of His, when really and truly they are not. Beginning in verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. We started with, I'm not the judge. Guess what? I'm also not the judge of me. And I need to constantly be examining and not saying, well, I guess I feel like I'm okay. And I'm confident that that person, I'm not saying, again, that we can never have confidence in people's salvation. I cringe when I hear people who've been Christians all their lives make a comment along this line, well, I hope I make it to heaven. You know, 1 John, he writes and he says, I write these things that you may have confidence in your salvation. Sometimes we're so wrapped up and worried about what we think somebody is saved, instead of worrying about, am I? Jesus said, you want to be right, you've got to do what I tell you. You've got to heed my teachings. And so really the bottom line, and it comes back to what was said a while ago, is we've got to determine which reality do we want to live in. When we live in the reality where we worry about the fate of those that we can't control, or do we want to worry about the fate of the one life that we can control, and making sure that we heed the teachings and the will of God as He has instructed? All right, and I will leave you with that. Any other last comments or questions before we wrap up? All right, well, thank you for your attention. I know we've got just a minute or two before the kids start coming in, so you've got that, and they'll be here shortly.